Good morning, everyone. I hope that you're doing well this morning. I am looking forward to seeing you all shortly. And this morning, we're going to be getting back into where we left off in the book of Second Kings. What we're going to do this morning is wrap up some things that we didn't have time to get to last time. As you probably noticed, it was a few minutes longer than we normally have for our Bible classes. There just wasn't a great place to split things up. But there were a few different times last week when I mentioned that we were going to talk about some things next week, and that's specifically dealing with a few historical things and some archaeological stuff that I think will be interesting and faith affirming for us, and that's what we're going to be getting to then this morning. But we're also going to be wrapping up Hezekiah's story in Second Kings, particularly in Second Kings chapter 20. So what we're going to be doing then this morning is looking at some, like I said, the archaeological and historical stuff that was going in the text from last time, from the Assyrian siege, and then moving forward to talking about the rest of Kings in terms of what everything is going on there. So that's what we're going to do, and we're going to get started there to talk about some of those things. So to kind of refresh our memory from where we were last time and the Hezekiah siege in general, that is that where we find ourselves in 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19 is that Judah is stronger than ever. Judah is stronger than ever because its main rival and oppressor, the northern kingdom of Israel, had been destroyed by Assyria about 20 years before. And in those 20 years, a lot of people from the north, including a lot of the middle class, a lot of population, a lot of people bringing technology and literature and all sorts of other things, had, I guess we would call it, immigrated south and joined to Hezekiah's kingdom there in the south. Now, when this happens, it brings new money, it brings new people, it brings new ideas, and it brings new power to Hezekiah. No longer is he having to pay money to pay off tribute to the northern kingdom. And as we talked about last time, because of some shifts in Assyrian politics, no longer is he having to pay off and pay Assyria as much money either. So what's he going to do with all this money? Well, we're going to see that the Bible says, as particularly in 2nd Chronicles, that it starts going to his head a little bit. He prepares to rebel against Assyria, and he prepares to rebel for years. We'll see that he makes alliances, specifically with Egypt, and maybe, if we read between the lines, a little bit with Babylon. He increases the size of his armies, and he builds a lot of fortifications, both fortifying cities outside of Jerusalem and further fortifying Jerusalem. We'll look at some pictures and talk about that in particular this morning. This is helped about by some of that Assyrian turmoil that we mentioned last time, change in rulership, some threats to the south in Babylon and to the north with Urartu. And the ultimate conclusion, of course, to what happens to Israel or to Judah, I should say, it's not pretty. Almost every fortified city, we should say probably every fortified city in Judah, except for Jerusalem, is destroyed. Hezekiah has to strip the temple and the palace of his riches in order to pay off the Assyrians. That still doesn't work. They still are going to besiege Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is not destroyed, and Assyria does go home. So I guess in some ways, when you keep the field, you are in power. But Judah is back under Assyria's thumb, which is also what Assyria wanted as well. But there are a few different things that can kind of show us and kind of lead us into some neat things I think that will be interesting to talk about. The first is I'm going to go over to the PowerPoint focus here so you can see a little bit better. The first is what we mentioned last time is called Hezekiah's Tunnel. This was mentioned specifically, it talks about in Chronicles, but it also talks about at the very end of in Hezekiah's legacy there in the last two verses of chapter 20. It talks about him building a conduit and bringing water into the city. This is a side view that kind of shows us how he does that. This is kind of brought about because of because when you're in a city and you're going to be under siege, like he knew, then the most important thing is not just to build up food. You can actually have, partial rations for a long time. It's to make sure you have water. Water is the thing that's going to run out the most quickly. Now, Jerusalem, if we look back at this map a little bit, does have a water source. The problem with the water source, the way it was in Jerusalem at the time, is that this water source was outside of the city walls. Okay? So if you've got it outside of the city walls, you have to figure out how to bring it inside the walls. You can kind of see where the walls are at this time. You've got the upper city here with the temple, and then there's the king's palace that we're circling now. And you've got then the spring down here, but you need to bring it into the city. Now water flows downhill, so he has to dig this huge, long, very complicated tunnel to get everything into here. And the way he does that, here's a side view that makes it a little bit easier, is he's going to dig what we know as Hezekiah's tunnel. It's pretty neat, actually. Those of us who've been to Jerusalem, I know David's walked through it before. I don't think he did last time when we were all there together, but Catherine and I walked through it, and a bunch of other people. Is you can actually go through the tunnel, and you can walk down and get through the steps to see how all this works. Now, this tunnel was rediscovered by, I guess, modern archaeologists in 1880. It winds through a particular type of rock. It's called dolomite rock for 533 meters. And the way it probably works, because if you think about how difficult this would have been to dig this tunnel in antiquity, I mean, you think about what you need to dig a tunnel anyway, right? You got to make sure there's enough air in there. You've got to find a way to get the rock out. You've got to find a way to dig it. You have to figure out a way to make sure that it ends up where you want to go when you're, underground and you don't have survey maps the same way you do, and we don't have, radar and things that we do. It's a pretty incredible feat that we see here. Probably the way it occurred is there was probably a little trickle of water that went through. This is called a karstic channel. And they followed that water to connect different things until they met in the middle of the tunnel. Now, before, it was found by this guy, Warren, who was going spelunking, and he found this shaft here that enlarged in the place where it came here from the Gihon Spring, and into now what we know is the Pool of Siloam down at the bottom of Jerusalem. And you have then this huge, long, meandering tunnel that goes all the way. It's really, really neat when you go to get to go there. It's a pretty incredible connection. It's so long. It's so deep underground. When you're walking through there, particularly if you go like most tourist trips to Israel go in the middle of the summer, it's cool. The water's cold. Feels fantastic on your feet. Of course, it's also very dark and at times narrow. At some points I'm kind of like crouching down and turning sideways to fit through it. But it was incredible, and back then they were pretty excited about it as well. And in fact, the guild that dug the tunnel out commissioned their own. I guess this would be the equivalent of when builders or would etch their names into things like the pylons for the Empire State Building, or concrete layers. You put your handprint or something and put your initials in there. But this is what they write. And they put this here at the middle of the tunnel. It says, "This is the record of how the tunnel was breached. While the excavators using their pickaxes, each man towards his neighbor, and while there were yet 3 cubits for the breach, a voice was heard, each calling to his neighbor. So they struck pickaxe against pickaxe. Then the water flowed from the spring of the pool a distance of 1,200 cubits, with 100 cubits of rock over our head." It's pretty incredible. Now, people aren't exactly sure. This is a replica of the original, exactly where it came from. But if you're paying really close attention when you're in the tunnel, you can actually see by the striations from where the pickaxes were going one way and when they started going the other way and when they kind of connected between. So it's this incredible feat of engineering undertaken there at the time of Hezekiah to bring water into the city for when they're going to be under siege. And it worked really, really well. The other thing that they do, the next thing that it talks about Hezekiah doing, and this is also discussed in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, and at the end of the book of Kings in chapter 20, it's pretty neat how those things work, is he builds this thing called the Broad Wall. Now, the reason they call it the Broad Wall is, you guessed it, because it's broad. It's 7 meters, I had to put that in, about 23 feet thick. It's about 25 feet high, and it defends a particular part of the city that was pretty weak. And if you pay attention to this picture, it's pretty cool. You can kind of see that there were other things that were here. Let me show you with the laser pointer a little bit. So if you look right here, you can tell this is part of a wall. You see that corner? And it's been cut in between. In other words, this used to be a house, but eminent domain by the king has brought it down so that what we have left is not the house, but instead is, whoops, don't need that. And what we have left then is this wall. In fact, it's going to be specifically mentioned here. This is an overview of it from, there's a Jerusalem cat. But if you look here, you can see this part of the house that's been broken down. This is looking from above. Here we have a map of the city, and this is the northwest part of the wall. So the Temple Mount was up here, okay? And the city of David's down here. And these are the walls, this dotted line are the walls of where Hezekiah had put things. And he builds the broad wall right here to fortify the city. Now, if you go to Jerusalem now, where they call the old city is actually wrapping around here, but the city in Jerusalem is actually pretty small, very small. In fact, if you look at the city of David, it's even tinier, but it fortifies that part. And what's neat about looking at these pictures of the walls, it's exactly what we read about in the Bible. So Isaiah, who is of course a prophet that we run into a lot during the time of Hezekiah, and can kind of give us a lot of additional information about what's going on in Hezekiah's reign, says this, to the king, "You saw the breaches of the city of David were many." And he talks about, you dug a tunnel to bring water into the city, and you fortified walls around, and it says you broke down houses to fortify a wall. Well, what do we see exactly here? But this is broken down houses, and you take the eminent domain to kind of take the city and take the bricks and take everything, and you build it into this massive wall. 2 Chronicles kind of talks about the same thing. It says that Hezekiah set to work resolutely and built up all the wall that was broken down and raised towers on it and outside of it, and he built another wall. This is that broad wall that we see. Now, the most impressive fortifications in Judah weren't actually in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is the capital, but it wasn't really the most powerful city. We might think about it for Florida. Tallahassee is the capital of Florida, but it's not really the largest or most important city, right? That we would think of as Gainesville or Orlando or Tampa or Miami or something like that. Most people who don't live in Florida or Alabama don't really know about Tallahassee, even if they've heard other places. It's not really that happening of a place. And in ancient Judah, what that was, the big powerful city was actually Lachish. And this is where one of the places that David was able to dig, I'm sure he has shown pictures of it to us before. And here on the left, it's built on the top of this huge hill. I need to get new pictures because they've actually excavated a lot, but these are just the old pictures that I had. They had this huge ramp and this gatehouse where you'd have to turn around and then break through and then come up the city. And nobody really wants to go through the gatehouse because it's super heavily fortified and powerful. So what the Assyrians do instead is they actually come over here and they build a ramp. You can actually see here, I'm going to highlight it for you. This is what's left over of the ramp. They just built a ramp, and I'll show you some pictures in a second. And what they do is they build a huge siege engine, and they just run it up the ramp. It goes over the walls. They breach the city. They go in. Bada bing, bada boom. They are able to conquer then the city. In fact, as we read through in the Bible, they conquer all of the cities there except for Jerusalem. Now, one other thing that's kind of neat to see, archaeologically speaking, is when you build all these cities up in Jerusalem, you need to make sure that they have food and water. And one of the ways that you would make sure that they had provisions is the king would send to all the royal cities, all the places where he's got soldiers lodged, and part of these supply chains. He would take provisions, and I'll zoom in a little closer here so you can see what's going on, and he would send these jars of provisions. Now, this is a map of Judah. And what it does, here's the Dead Sea, here's Bethlehem, here's Jerusalem right here. All these dots that you see, these are all of the places where specific type of royal provisions are found. What do I mean by a specific type of royal provisions? I mean that they find these special jars, these massive jars, and on all of the jars are these special things called lamellic seals. Now, what do I mean by a lamellic seal? Well, it's just like this. Let me zoom in a little closer for you so you can see. It's these very specific seals that come here, and they are generally of a scarab beetle. Okay, a scarab beetle is very famous in Egyptian stuff. You also see the Egyptian ankh right here. And they have several different types of scarab beetles. You've got the 2-wing variety here, or they also had a 4-wing variety. There's on a different picture. But what it says on all of these different scarab beetles is that these belong to the king. In other words, these are royal provisions. And when you look at where they occur, and you can actually do some really cool analysis on the jars. I'm not a big sciencey person, but I think this is pretty cool. It's a spectrographic analysis, and they can send light through the clay, and every piece of clay has a distinct signature of where you get it from. And so they can see that all these jars, all the clay, come from particular places, centralized planning. It's not like everybody's just copying the same thing. And since they're made in clay and all these jars are made by hand, they can actually test the thumbprints on a lot of them. And they're made by very, very few people. In other words, this is a result of centralized planning, of centralized provision, that this is something that Hezekiah has absolutely planned to do from the beginning. And just as he's planned to set this thing up, he's done all these different things. But I would ask you to remember, we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, is what do we see on these royal provisions? 2 things: a scarab beetle, and the second thing is an ankh, an Egyptian ankh. Now, the last thing I wanted to just kind of quickly mention, and we don't have to go through this whole thing, is this really cool artifact right here. It's called Sennacherib's prison. Now, if you remember, Sennacherib is the king of Assyria who has invaded. He's the guy who's kind of conquering everything. And in the prison, let me highlight it for you a little bit. It's right around here. I don't know if you can see that. Right around there. It talks about his campaign over to Israel and his campaign of Judah. He actually specifically mentions Hezekiah. He says, as for Hezekiah the Judahite, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities and surrounding smaller towns, which were without number. And notice what he says he uses: using packed down ramps and applying battering rams and infantry attacks, and made breaches and siege machines and all these different things. It says he conquered them and took out 200,000 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep without number. He counted them all as spoil, right? He takes all these people as slaves and as spoil. And the king himself, he says, I locked him up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. And I surrounded him with earthworks, and I made it unthinkable for him to exit by the city gate. And these cities which I had despoiled, I cut off from the land, and I gave them to Mittani. I imposed dues and gifts for my lordship upon him, in addition to the former tribute. And Hezekiah was overwhelmed by the awesome splendor of my lordship, and he sent after my departure to Nineveh, my royal city, his elite troops and best soldiers, which he had brought in as reinforcements, to strengthen Judah with 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, choice antimony, large blocks of carnelian, beds of ivory, armchairs of ivory, elephant hides, etc., etc., etc. And if we looked at other examples of this too, this is, it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but this is a part of some wall reliefs, and I guess we'd call it Sennacherib's trophy room back in Nineveh, and it shows just those events occurring. It includes the siege of Lachish and a lot of other places, and you see kind of people bringing tribute and bowing down to him and everything else. Now, why am I showing this to you? Is it just because it's, cool and there's pictures and it's pretty? No, that's part of it, right? But that's not the main reason that I'm sharing it. The main reason I'm sharing it as part of our Bible class is because I do think that when we look at all these things, it is both faith affirming, and I will suggest when we get to the end of our Bible class this morning, that it is particularly helpful for us to understand some things about Hezekiah's legacy and his character, that it affirms absolutely what we see in the Bible. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think that when we look through all these different things, there's more that we could show you, right? We could, for example, we could talk about, there's this Greek historian Herodotus who may sort of kind of talk about something that's sort of kind of like the attack on Jerusalem. That when we look at all these things, all these pieces of information from Assyria and from the Bible and from archaeology and from history, all of the facts of the events agree. In other words, the Bible is good history. It is truthful. It is giving us the information. Everything agrees, whether we're talking about in the Bible, in chapter 19, that all of the towns except for Jerusalem are taken and captive and destroyed, and that Sennacherib eventually returns to Nineveh, and that he's killed in a palace coup. But even though the events are the same, the interpretations, it is true, the interpretations of the events do differ a little bit. Because when we're reading in the Bible, we read, of course, that God's angel comes and wipes out the Assyrian army, and they flee home. But the Assyrian records there in Sennacherib's prison doesn't say that. Now, we might ask, why doesn't it say that? And skeptics of the Bible say, well, see, it doesn't believe that, it doesn't agree with the Bible, it doesn't say the same exact thing, so we can't trust the Bible. And that's simply not true. First of all, we wouldn't expect the Assyrians to talk about why they were defeated. This is just not something the ancient documents do in general. For example, when the Egyptians fight against the Hittites in one of the most famous battles in antiquity, the Egyptians absolutely lose. They're driven off. But you read the Egyptian records and they say, no. See, we definitely won because they didn't come and invade Egypt. And that's true, but it's a propagandistic spin. In other words, we're not going to expect Assyria to talk about their defeats. Instead, they're going to put a pot of spin. Look at all the cities we did destroy, and we did besiege Jerusalem, and we did shut them up like a bird in a cage. It doesn't say we destroyed Jerusalem, it doesn't say we took Jerusalem, but that's what we expect, which is that they don't lie, but they do spin the truth a little bit. The second reason is it's not for sure that the Assyrians even knew exactly what was killing them. It's not necessarily true that the angel was visible. Maybe it used a plague. Maybe it used something else. Maybe they didn't know why all these people died and they left. Herodotus, he talks about a kind of a similar sort of a story. It's, again, not really about Jerusalem, but it is about Sennacherib. He says, after the Sennacherib, king of the Arabians and the Assyrians marched a large army against Egypt, when a number of field mice, pouring in among their enemies, devoured their quivers and their bows and the handles of their shields, and then the next day when they had no weapons, they leave. So it's a similar-ish story, probably not talking about the same thing, but maybe reminiscent of it. But again, what I want to emphasize here is that we have every reason, whenever we can check the Bible against other histories and other evidence, the Bible is absolutely vindicated. Now, that doesn't mean these other sources, these other positions always say exactly the same thing in exactly the same way as the Bible. Their interpretations of the events are not always exactly the same. But it does mean that we have reasons to believe the historicity and the believability and the truthfulness of the Bible. And the reign of Hezekiah is one of these places, one of the few places really in the Old Testament where we have lots of different kinds of information, and we can look at it all kind of together, and we find that the Bible is vindicated in that way. And I think that's a useful thing for us to look at just for half of a class period, to say that, look, even in these historical sections where we may be not expecting a whole lot of other things to include, the Bible's truthful. And I always think that that is worthwhile for us to consider. But I don't want to spend a whole class period on that. I do want to get back into the biblical text to particularly go over to 2 Kings chapter 20, and we're going to be reading these texts in a second. The first story that we read about comes from 2 Kings chapter 20 in the first 11 verses. And so I'm going to go ahead and read those first 11 verses for us now. In those days, Hezekiah became sick and was at the point of death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, came to him and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you will die. You will not recover." Then Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord, saying, "Now, O Lord, please remember how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with the whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. And before Isaiah had gone out of the middle of the court, the word of the Lord came to him, "Turn back, and say to Hezekiah, the leader of my people, thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Behold, I will heal you. On the third day you should go up to the house of the Lord, and I will add 15 years to your life. And I will deliver you and the city out of the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will deliver the city for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake." And Isaiah said, "Bring a cake of figs, let them take and lay it on the boil, so that he may recover." Scroll down a little bit here. And Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "What shall be the sign that the Lord will heal me, and that I should go up to the house of the Lord on the third day?" And Isaiah said, "This shall be the sign to you from the Lord, and the Lord will do this thing he has promised. Should the shadow go forward 10 steps, or back 10 steps?" And Hezekiah answered, "It's an easy thing for the shadow to lengthen 10 steps. Rather let the shadow retract 10 steps. And Isaiah the prophet called to the Lord, and he brought the shadow back 10 steps, by which he had gone down to the steps of Ahaz. So we have this situation here with Hezekiah's illness there in the first few verses of chapter 20, and we read that it occurs in those days. Now, in those days is a pretty general statement. Here, though, we do know a little bit more what it means. It comes from the time period of Assyria's invasion, and it means in the days of the events we just talked about, in the days of the events of chapters 18 and 19. And we have further reason to believe that is because he says there in verse 3 and following, he says that he's going to not just save Hezekiah, but he's going to save the city from the Assyrians. In other words, this is another story that comes from the midst of the Assyrian invasion. And it seems to be that this is not just a general sickness. This is a sickness that is a plague from God. And Isaiah the prophet comes, the same Isaiah that we read about in the Bible, the same Isaiah that has the book of Isaiah that we have in our prophets, the same Isaiah we saw in the past few chapters. He comes to Hezekiah and he delivers the bad news, a prophet here, not just of gloom and doom, I guess we could say. And he says, "You're going to die," and that's what God says. Now, we don't know exactly what the reason for Hezekiah's death sentence is. But since we know this occurs from the period of the Assyrian invasion, and we know that the things that Isaiah has done wrong in the Assyrian invasion are his pride and his trusting in the nations, in particular trusting in Egypt, then that's probably what is going on here. But what's amazing about what Hezekiah does here is that he doesn't do what we've seen the kings in the book of Kings do before. He doesn't seek doctors. He doesn't seek the Rephaim, the cult of the ancestors. Instead, he immediately seeks God in prayer. A David-like reaction. And it helps cement his place in the roles of the great kings of Judah. And his prayer is simple but profound. He says, God, pay attention to me. I have been faithful. I've done what you wanted. Now that doesn't mean that Hezekiah pretends he's not sinned. It doesn't mean that Hezekiah pretends that he's perfect. It means he says, I have been faithful to you, and I ask that you be faithful to me. And Isaiah hasn't even finished walking outside of the temple yet. He hasn't finished walking outside of the courtyard yet of the palace. When God comes to him and says, turn around, go back, and bring this word to Hezekiah. Tell him that the God of David has heard your prayer and seen your tears. That here God is faithful to Hezekiah, not just because Hezekiah has been faithful to him, but because God is faithful to his servant David. And did you notice when he's going to heal him? This is one of these kind of minor passages I mentioned in the sermon that we did on the third day. The resurrections happen on the third day, and this sort of thing is all over the Old Testament. I didn't get to go into all of the passages that show that, but this is one of them, right? That he is saved from death on the third day. He gets 15 years more of life. God is going to defend them against Israel. He brings them a cake of figs, and they boil it, and they put it either on the boil or on the wound. If it's a boil, it's probably related to the sickness. If it's a wound, it could have been from maybe him fighting against the Assyrians. We don't know. But he still asks for a sign. Now, in the context of what we've seen generally in the Bible and in Kings, this is a bad thing. It's like Gideon keeping on asking for a sign, or Moses who just keeps on asking for a sign because of his lack of faith. But in the context of Isaiah's ministry, this is actually a good thing. One of the most famous signs that Isaiah does is to Hezekiah's father, Ahaz. Remember, Ahaz says, I'm not going to ask for a sign, God, in chapter 7, because he doesn't want to do what the prophet tells him to do. And Isaiah points to a pregnant woman. He says, before that woman gives birth, the city is going to be saved. And it's in that context that we read that Hezekiah is not like his father Ahaz. Instead, he is like his father David. He asks for a sign, and Isaiah gives him a sign, and he does what God commands him to do. Now, we can move forward then to the next story that at first seems like it's not related, but we're going to find out that it is actually quite related. And that is, we're going to find out what's going to happen here between Hezekiah and Babylon. This is kind of what we've titled the lesson around, is this concept there of Hezekiah and Babylon. So let's go ahead and read those verses here, starting in chapter 20, verse 8. And Hezekiah said to Isaiah, I meant to start in verse 12. We already read verses 8 through 11. Verse 12 through 19. At that time, Merodach-Baladan, the king of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to King Hezekiah, for he had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah welcomed them, and he showed them all his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his armory, all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in all his house or all of his realm that Hezekiah didn't show them. Then Isaiah the prophet came to King Hezekiah, and he said to him, what did these men say? And from where did they come to you? And Hezekiah said, they have come from a far country, from Babylon. And he said, why have they seen in your house? And Hezekiah answered him, they have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that your fathers have stored up to this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, will be taken away, and they will be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. For he thought, why not, if there will be peace and security in my day? Now this is a really fascinating text in the book of Kings. That we've seen that Judah can look forward to 15 more years with a good king, Hezekiah, on the throne. But the long-term future of Judah is not good. That we have yet another episode that features Hezekiah and Isaiah, and we have him answering questions about the future, that after his illness he receives a visit from the emissaries of Merodach-Baladan, or if we're reading Babylonian records or Assyrian records, Marduk-Apla-Adina. He's fighting against Assyria at this time. Like the description of Hezekiah's sickness, this has to occur before 701, before the direct siege of Jerusalem that occurs then by Assyria. It's been popular since the time of Josephus there in the 1st century to say that this is a mission to gain other allies to fight against Assyria. There is some reason to believe that, although it's not necessarily the case. In fact, in the Bible, both in Isaiah chapter 39 and in 2 Chronicles 32 verse 31, it doesn't mention anything about an alliance. Instead, that it's because of this miraculous sign that occurred. Regardless, we see, though, what does occur is that Hezekiah falls into this prideful situation that we've seen already and that we're going to see again in his, later temporally, but before us textually, in his actions towards the rebellion against Assyria, and that is he is trusting in his wealth. He shows the Babylonians everything. Kind of like Solomon when he shows the Queen of Sheba everything he has. And Isaiah the prophet shows up, and this time he's not coming up to tell him, oh, you're going to be fine. Oh, no, he again is bringing doom against Judah. He says Babylon's going to come back, and they're going to remember all this, and they're going to carry away everything you have. Your sons and your daughters, everything that you've built up will come to nothing. It will all be taken away. And Hezekiah makes this really kind of strange response. At least it seems strange to us. He says, well, as long as there's peace and security in my days. And there's kind of 3 ways we could take this. The first is really bad for Hezekiah, right? That it would say that, well, I don't care, it doesn't bother me, I've secured peace in our time, to quote Neville Chamberlain or something like that. And that's possible. Another possibility is that he's going to say something like, I believe that God will bring this about, but at least he has delayed it. Or that this is inevitable judgment, but I'm glad at least it will come after my time. 2 Chronicles chapter 32 verse 31 says that God has done this to test Hezekiah, to check and see if there was pride in his heart, and that it is pride that causes so much destruction. It's his pride that he's built up this wealth. It's his pride that he thinks he's so powerful, and that's what's going to ultimately lead to the destruction of Hezekiah, and that it's going to lead to the destruction of Judah, is the pride of its kings. And then we come then to the last section here, a short section, just 2 verses, that we're going to read now, verses 20 and 21. The rest of the deeds of Hezekiah and all of his might, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And Hezekiah slept with his fathers, and Manasseh his son reigned in his place. And that ending's kind of climactic, right? That we read again, okay, he built this Hezekiah's tunnel to bring water to the city, and he slept with his fathers. His son Manasseh is going to reign in his place. But we have this function of his legacy. What do I mean, this function of his legacy? It means that when we consider everything else that he's done, we see that there are both good things and bad things. We might say this way. I'll go and zoom in a little closer to help us read this. It says, Hezekiah is a king who's like David. And that's true. I mean, think about all the good things that he does. He removes the high places. He listens to the prophets. He repents when he sins. He seeks God rather than idols. But even though he's a king like David, he's not perfect. He still struggles and falls to pride. He still relies on the nations. He turns to Egypt. He turns to Babylon. He focuses on his wealth and his riches. Really what's going on here in the book of Kings is that the author doesn't just want a king like Hezekiah, or a king we're going to read about in a few weeks, a king like Josiah. He doesn't even want a king that's like David. He longs for a king who is better than David. That ultimately, what everybody wants, what the king recognizes, the writer of Kings realizes that we need is Jesus. Now, he doesn't know everything about Jesus, but he knows parts. He knows what Israel needs if they're going to be saved. Now, remember what we mentioned here, that distrusting in Egypt is a real problem. It's something that specifically God is going to address, already addressed. But it's something we even saw then if we want to think back to those scarab seals, which were on the kind of the thumbprint there on the top of these jars of supplies that the king sent out. The scarab was, of course, a sign typical of Egypt. And the Ankh definitely is. The way that people dress and what they put on their scarab, their personal seals, their scarab seals, was indicating who they were, what their identity was. And here in his efforts to court Egyptian power, Hezekiah is presenting himself like an Egyptian. And that is a no-no in the Bible. That God says repeatedly, don't go back to Egypt. And that God is eventually going to bring them into a new Egyptian bondage because they've wanted so badly to go to Egypt. But here we have, for once in the book of Kings, for the first time really in the book of Kings, we have a king who stacks up to David. And he's going to give the kingdom a generation of blessings. But the people have rejected him. And to some degree, even then, in the end of his life, with his pride and with his decisions, he has, in some ways, shown that he has rejected God. Now, what we need, all of us, is something better than an earthly king. It's like the psalm said, put not your trust in princes, O Israel, but in the Prince, the Son of God, in Jesus Christ. Look forward to talking to you about Manasseh and moving forward into the deepest, darkest parts of the king's history next week. Look forward to seeing you in person soon. And I look forward to talking to you a little bit more on this digital media in the sermon coming up in just a few minutes. I hope that you have a blessed Lord's Day and look forward to continuing our study in the future.